Hi, everybody. Welcome back to TSAM Digital. Today, I have with me Murray Campbell. Murray is the CASS business consultant at Autorek. Hi, Murray. Just to kick things off, could you give us a brief introduction about Autorek and let us, our audience, know a little bit about yourself?
Hello, hi there, everyone. Yeah, so as was introduced, I'm Murray Campbell, a CASS business consultant for Autorek. So my job covers many aspects, making sure well abreast of what's happening in CASS in particular. I'm working with many teams across Autorek. That includes delivering solutions for clients, making sure it meets their requirements, working with sales and marketing and creating worthwhile content to share across the industry. And Autorek as a whole is a financial data control and management tool, primarily used as a solution around reconciliations, and obviously CASS itself being quite a sweet spot in that respect, but can be used across other industries within financial services as well, and covers banking, payments and insurance as well. So we have a wealth experience over, I think, around 27 years of working with many firms, particularly, as I said, around the CASS reconciliation space and helping firms meet the needs of the rules in that space.
All right, brilliant. How would you summarize the challenges asset management firms have faced over the last 18 months, in particular with reference to CASS compliance?
It's been quite a period, hasn't it? Now we're now saying 18 months. I remember when we used to speak about the previous 3 months or previous 6 months, and now we're 18 months on and still speaking about it. When I think back to sort of February, March 2020, I was in a different role at that time. I was working within CASS operations, so I was very much aware of the kind of day-to-day challenges that firms were facing. And I remember within my team, we were doing client money reconciliations, and we were planning for a whole team working from home test so that we could to give ourselves comfort that we could get all of our vital CASS day-to-day processes completed while all of our team was working from home, with the safety net of the rest of the operational business still working from the office. And we went from that small single-day sample test to the entire company working from home in what felt like the blink of an eye, and it possibly was as short as a week where that happened. And it really just reinforces the speed at which that change had to happen and was forced upon firms at that time. And there was many challenges that came with that, none more so than obviously making sure everyone had the right physical IT equipment and was actually able to work from home and from a location not in the office. But obviously at the time it coincided with kind of huge amount of market volatility, and that in turn brought huge transactional volumes and additional stresses and strains on infrastructure and IT systems and back office systems, having to cope with that extra volume. And that had then a significant impact on the downstream processes that we see in operations, and particularly around the CASS space in terms of reconciliations. And the focus for firms at that time, and where I was in particular, was very much on what is the day-to-day BAU essential items that we have to get done every single day to service the assets of our clients, and also to meet the requirements of CASS. So what we did certainly was around a big prioritization exercise around what tasks must be completed and what do we now need to consider as nice to haves that can be put to one side for a period of time, so that we focus very much on the day-to-day BAU, making sure we have all those essential processes completed on a daily basis, so that we are meeting the requirements of the CASS rules. And I think that kind of kept us going for a month or two as volumes were so high. But I think firms then adapted to that way they were working. The markets definitely settled down and volumes settled down with that. And it just gave everyone a chance to probably take a little breath and kind of reset and adjust to the way we were working. And that then in turn just allowed processes to fall into that new way of working, and they matured alongside that. And as that happens, and as teams and businesses got the hang of the way that they were going to be working, and also, let's be honest, it became very clear that this wasn't going to change anytime soon, that the focus then also started to shift to, okay, so we're keeping the lights on, we're turning the wheels, the priority tasks are all being achieved, but what more can we also look to deliver? And it's kind of, and it was introducing that element of how can we deliver against a change agenda while we're still working from home. So we're still going to have an annual CASS audit that comes up, and we're still going to have to meet the requirements of that. We still have, for example, we still have manual processes that we would like to automate. So how are we going to go around achieving that while we're all working remotely, and while we're still obviously getting the BAU done? What other capacity can we build in and try and introduce? And certainly now, the firms that we speak to at Autorek, a number of firms have done incredibly well over the last 18 months and have grown as a result of doing well, and that in itself has imposed a need on them to embrace change and introduce change. So firms have definitely been able to switch back that sense of focus, and not only need to keep the lights on and get the BAU tasks done, but also deliver on the additional tasks that they would always have looked to have done anyway had they been office-based. Because as we said, we're 18 months on, there is still an element of this. I'm obviously at home still just now, and so there was very much a need for firms to then return to that ability to deliver change whilst also kind of keeping the lights on and working from that new situation. So I think firms quickly adapted to that, have done incredibly well in that respect, and I think individuals have as well. There's a nice balance to be had to life while working from home, and it allows people to achieve as well, whether that is through the balance of having more time at their desk without commuting and so on. So there was a real, I suppose, to sum up, an immediate kind of pause, make sure we can get everything done that we need to. And then as processes and systems matured in that kind of working remotely environment, they were able to return far more to kind of delivering against changes that they would be looking to embrace. So I think firms have done incredibly well overall.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Murray, for that explanation. How have we observed the significance attached to CASS compliance conveyed by the FCA, and where do priorities exist for CASS regulations?
Good question. So I think, throughout the piece, right back to the start of the first lockdown, there's been clear and frequent and consistent messaging from the FCA around the importance of CASS, and really reinforcing that to firms to make sure they're aware of the need to meet their requirements around CASS. And from the outset, there was communication from the FCA about CASS and coronavirus, addressing some of the main questions and queries they'd received from investment firms around CASS, thinking particularly in terms of how they handle the receipt of physical assets and physical asset reconciliations. And that really kind of reinforced straight away from the FCA that firms had to be meeting the requirements of CASS. However, it did kind of acknowledge from the FCA that there may be a delay in some respects around kind of ongoing CASS improvement projects. So the FCA did recognise that from the outset. And then ongoing, we've seen throughout the last year a number of Dear CEO letters specifically around CASS, where the FCA has continued to reinforce that message. So they've spoken specifically about high client money balances that they've seen, and areas where they've seen the inappropriate use of TTCAs, for example. And that was really reinforcing messages to firms to make sure they were aware of their CASS environment, taking action where appropriate, and just letting firms know, should I say, that the FCA was always monitoring this behaviour and activity. And then more broadly, towards the end of the year, we saw the Dear CEO letter around adequate and appropriate organisational structures around CASS. And this covered many aspects of CASS, including governance, records and reconciliations, and third-party oversight, for example. And it reinforced the message to firms that you need to review your CASS environment, you need to identify areas for any improvement and prioritise change around that, and look to carry out and take forward change wherever possible. And this, as I previously mentioned, this was moving on from the FCA's initial communication, which was accepting of the fact that there may be some delays around CASS improvement programmes. This was a number of months on, the FCA saying that they were expecting to see firms taking projects forward and identifying priorities where firms saw most fit. And then ultimately towards the end of the year, I think it was December time, we saw the final notice around the fine that the FCA issued for client money and client asset failings. And as always, this type of final notice should act as a prompt to firms to review their own arrangements, their own processes and their own environment to make sure that they are not falling foul of any of the same or similar types of issues that have been called out within that final notice. So that acts again as a further reminder to firms about the importance of CASS from the regulator. In terms of ongoing priorities, I think obviously CASS isn't going to go away anywhere, so it's going to continue to be important. I think fitting in with much of the FCA's agenda, there's going to be a continuation of the drive towards automation, ensuring the resilience of processes is always there. I think where firms are reliant on manual processes, this gives rise to concern for the FCA and for CASS auditors as well. So reliance on manual processes will face inherent issues. So where automation can be embraced and harnessed will bring many benefits to firms, and the regulator sees that as well. But then kind of building on from that, where we then introduce the reliance on technology and automation, we then also have to make sure we have sufficient IT controls in place so that we are not simply relying on the technology doing what we expect it to do. We make sure, and firms make sure they have controls in place to be able to substantiate and stand behind the data that their systems is providing for them. So making sure they have completeness of data and so on and so forth. So I think having appropriate IT controls is going to be a continuing issue and significance as well. And then finally, just to briefly touch on a third one, is just around the oversight of third parties. So I think that's an ever important issue for firms. Where they have outsourced CASS processes, always important to be mindful of the fact that responsibility is not also outsourced. So how do firms make sure they have oversight of that? How do they have sufficient controls in place to make sure they're aware of how those processes are being executed by the third party? So I think that will be a continuing important area for firms in this respect as well.
Excellent. Murray, now we're reaching towards the end of the interview. I'm going to ask you one last question. Where do you see the key focus area for asset management firms in respect to CASS as we look ahead?
So I suppose just touching on or building on previously. So I think automation, I think for investment firms, for asset management firms, I think many processes are built around Excel, as we all know. We've all used it, and it's a very handy tool for a first port of call for building processes. So I think delivering automation where possible, and particularly I think around the reconciliation space, where firms are perhaps reliant on Excel at the moment, where automation can be introduced, can really introduce many benefits for firms. Removing resource reliance on perhaps subject matter experts who are needed for the processing of reconciliations, for example, and freeing them up to provide greater value for firms, I think will be an important aspect. Again, as I've already mentioned, touching on the IT control aspect of that. So where firms introduce any technology or automation, it's going to come with a need to have sufficient IT controls around it. And all of that feeds quite nicely into the ops resilience agenda and making sure that processes are resilient, can continue to meet the needs of clients, can continue to service clients, and can continue to meet the needs of the CASS rules, irrespective of the challenges that come firms' way. As we've seen over the last 18 months, what a brilliant time to learn about that sort of resilience and the capabilities of firms. So I think that will continue to be a priority. And I think we're a number of years on now, about 5 years on from the introduction of the FRC assurance standards, which placed that requirement on firms to be aware of the applicable CASS rules and the appropriate mapping of risks and controls alongside that. So I think for firms, many of which will maybe have maintained that relationship on an ongoing basis, for other firms, they may have seen that as a point in time exercise. So I think for those firms, it will be important to revisit that, to make sure that where they documented controls in the past, that they remain appropriate, the controls are still in place, are still operating successfully, or where they've introduced automation over that time, have they correctly captured the controls that came along with that automation, to make sure that that was now scoped in as part of that overall FRC assurance scoping piece. So I think that will be an important exercise for firms as well. So that should be enough to keep them going for now, I would think.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Murray, for your time and this useful information. Hopefully our audience have enjoyed as well. And do not forget to get in touch with Autorek and attend their sessions at TSAM London Live this week. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks all.